Please welcome your host, Clare Beumont.
Welcome to the Leadership Experiment podcast, where bold thinking meets real dialogue. I'm Clare Beumont, and I'm joined today by Richard Kelly, Christine Seddon, and Michael Curtin. Three brilliant minds on leadership and lots of fun as well. If you've listened to our past dialogues on AI-augmented leadership or curiosity, you know we're not here to deliver lectures. We're here to explore leadership with curiosity, honesty, and the occasional mic drop. Today's episode is called Strategic Leadership in the Face of Complexity. Richard led our most recent dialogue on this topic, and things got real. We dug into the difference between complicated and complex problems, explored cognitive overwhelm, and debated what strategic leadership actually looks like when the storm hits. Let's dive in. Richard, you opened the dialogue with the image of a perfect storm and two sailboats, one navigating with foresight, one stuck in old habits. Why that metaphor?
Thanks, Claire. I call it the two-boat paradox. Same problem, two approaches. One boat is being led by an expert with skills and experience based on historical information. The other is being guided by a crew based on their assessment of the current situation as it arises. This nicely frames up the challenges of strategic leadership in the face of complexity, navigating converging forces, inflation, market dynamics, cost pressures, tariffs, climate change, none the least AI and geopolitical shifts, and trying not to capsize as a perfect storm potentially engulfs your operations. Many of Australia's leaders are in those metaphorical boats, but using maps designed for yesterday's weather. To expand, we mistake complicated problems, the ones with a right answer and something we generally know how to solve, for complex ones, where cause and effect is nonlinear and multivariate, such as what happens in a perfect storm. Problems where there is no roadmap, when the problem is hard to define, where we don't know what we really are dealing with because we haven't come across that problem before, unknown unknowns. And when we do that, when we mix up complex problems with complicated ones, we tend to use the wrong approach for solving that problem.
Richard, this metaphor really lands for me, being something of an ancient mariner myself, having an early naval career. And as well, I found myself asking, are we solving some of our 2025 problems with thinking from, a decade ago or even 2 decades ago? And what I find myself thinking is it applying old thinking to new problems? Seems to me that oftentimes we're taking the knowledge of it's a problem without actually going a little deeper and getting some understanding of the nature of the problem. And we use what might have worked for us at some time in our past, and we're using that that past expertise to address our current and future problems. So for me, there's something about the time, the temporal aspect of this, in that we often apply old thinking to new problems.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what you just said about key things there that leaped out for me were around expertise and time and using our old expertise to solve the new problems, the new challenges. And you can see how that can happen, right? Because when we go to school, when we go to university, we learn to be experts. We learn to get 100%. We learn that there is a right answer to a particular problem. And generally, when we bring people into organisations, we promote them first because of their expertise, because they're showing capability to do a job well. We praise them when they do a job well. We praise them based on their technical expertise. And then when people get promoted to become leaders, everything becomes a bit more grey. And we expect those same people with that technical expertise to now navigate ambiguity and lead through complex problems. And we also kind of expect them to do that at pace. We kind of don't necessarily slow down to allow a leader to solve a complex problem, which might require more time to think. For example, more reflection, more reflexivity, more noticing patterns and what's going on. So there's a real dissonance there where you start to see people letting go of their expertise and at the same time being challenged to solve problems quickly.
I love that thinking. And I just want to go back to something that you said, Michael, which is around us spending enough time in the problem space before we go into the solution space. And I wonder if there's an unlock provided through that. But let's unpack that a little bit, Richard. What do we mean by strategic leadership in the face of complexity? You had quite a bold hypothesis around this when we had the dialogue. Let's unpack that a little bit further.
Thanks, Claire. So my hypothesis was if the role of the strategic leader is to steward performance today while building the capability to thrive tomorrow, how do they do this in the face of complexity? And I really don't think we have, as leaders and cohorts of leaders in Australia, have a real answer to that. And that's what we're hoping to kind of unpack. We tried to unpack through the dialogue and hoping to unpack through this podcast to kind of get a bit deeper on what does that mean to thrive in the face of complexity.
And I think you talked in the dialogue, Richard, of leaders leading through complexity, having to live comfortably with discomfort. You introduced David Snowden's Cynefin framework, which, let's be honest, melted a few brains. For the listeners who missed it, can you give us a quick cheat sheet?
Love to, Claire. Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework has been one of the go-to frameworks to talk about complexity theory and particularly complex adaptive systems. He talks about 5 domains. In fact, the 5th domain is what he refers to as disorder, and nothing can actually stay in disorder. It has to go to one of the 4 other domains, which are then defined as ordered domains, which there are 2 of, and unordered domains, which surprisingly enough there is also 2 of, to make 5. In the ordered domains, which is where we've spent most of our time in our working lives, if not our personal lives, he splits those into the first one being simple and the second one being complicated. Now, the simple domain is the domain of best practice, policies and procedures, one right way of doing things codified, and everyone loves working in that process domain of simple because there is a solution and it's easy to find, cause and effect are direct and clear. The complicated domain is the domain of experts, the domain of knowledge, the domain where there are known unknowns, and we rely on this knowledge of experts to solve the problem, and there is one right answer. Then we go to the unordered domains of complex and chaotic. In the complex domain, which is the subject of what we're talking about today, that is the domain of unknown unknowns. That's the domain where there are multiple potential answers to the problems that we are experiencing. There is multivariant causality. Nothing is linear. We need to deal with ambiguity. It's living in a space of what we might also refer to as productive discomfort when we're trying to make decisions as leaders. The key thing between complicated and complex is how we deal with uncertainty. In the complicated domain, the knowledge of experts can drive out uncertainty to a certain extent and level, because human beings inherently do not like uncertainty. They try and apply that knowledge in the complex domain where you have to swim in the complexity, swim in the ambiguity. The 4th domain that I haven't mentioned yet in detail is the chaotic domain. That's where you have to act, sense and respond, because you can't live in or exist for long periods of time in the chaotic domain. You have to move to one of the other 3 domains.
That's so interesting. I also liked the complex, in the dialogue that we had for the leadership experiment, when we heard someone sharing the complex domain of parenting, and I reflected on my own parenting and how I'm taking my son to see a pediatrician and to support, the growth of my child. But I don't really know if that's going to help. And I'll need to continue to adapt and monitor and observe and try new things that will help my son thrive, and hopefully he'll turn out to be great. But I thought parenting was a really great example of a complex problem that we can all sort of get our head around. You don't know when it's never going to end. You don't really know how to define it. And then I also loved in the dialogue when we sort of brought it back to the organisation, and we talked about organisational performance, and some observations we heard in the dialogue about do you remember the old chestnut of restructuring organisations in an effort to find new or better organisational performance. And I remember we talked about how sometimes it can feel, particularly when you're bringing consultants in, that when the organisations are looking at cost out and restructuring and redundancies, it can be quite worrying, because you can think, are we solving what is quite a complex problem of organisational performance with a solution that rests in the complicated domain? I think we all know organisational performance, like you mentioned, Richard, it's complex because it requires us to look at so many different variables. You've got your internal value variables of culture and leadership and product and service, and even the office layout can be an interesting variable to look at. And then you've got your external factors like your regulation and the competitive landscape. So it's really, it was a nice example, I felt, in the dialogue, when we could land on that one and say, sometimes in our work, because we're trying to move at pace, it can feel like a nice, quick, easy fix to try and solve the challenge of organisational performance, solve that complex problem with a simple or complicated solution, a simple solution for a complicated or simple problem.
Christine, again, this is really resonating for me, and I love bringing that highly personal piece into it, for the fact that as leaders, as team members, as people in organisations, we are people as well, and that makes it kind of interesting. Also, like that example Richard gave in that the dialogue around leaders launching complex transformation initiatives as though they're relatively simple IT rollouts. And for me, again, going a little personal, I think I've led, and I think we've, one way or another, all been involved in transformation or transformations, ostensibly those fundamental shifts in our organisations or our teams or our functions. And we've kind of been seduced with the attractive concepts, the attractive language, or the dream for values and benefits. And we've been perhaps overly confident, in much the way you were describing, Christine, of using linear thinking, almost checklists that might exist in a simple domain in very complex environments. And for me, there's a real challenge there of having that confidence and that desire for certainty from that linearity that you were talking about, that doesn't work. So when you're in a complex domain, certainty, even though it's really attractive, isn't a luxury that we can afford.
I love that thinking, and it brings me back to someone I've started following during COVID, Ned Brockman, that crazy Sparky who ran around Australia. He talked about getting comfortable being uncomfortable, and it strikes me we're talking about us as leaders being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think some of that discomfort relates to not really realising what domain we're in, what type of problem we're dealing with. I wonder, Richard, have you got any insights for us? How can we tell what type of problem we're dealing with, what type of domain we're operating in?
Great question, Claire. So one of the complications in the complex and complicated world is that most problems have an element of both in them. However, because we've been trained as experts, we tend to take the complicated problem-solving hammer to these big, hairy, audacious problems and try and smash it with that. And the real difference when you're trying to differentiate which part of this rubric, which part of this problem is actually in the complex domain, it comes back to looking at typically behavioral problems. So it'll manifest itself as being stuck in old paradigms, using industry orthodoxies of the 2000s to work in business models of today, and not realizing that that takes a totally different shift in mindset, which plays into behaviors. And that's usually where we find this kind of dichotomy, that once we're going to use these complicated decision-making frameworks and processes. And if I go back to the two-boat metaphor, that the boat that's filled with the complicated problem solvers may not even be looking at the right problem.
Thank you, Richard. So it's almost like we're using the wrong mindset for the domain that we're in. One of the most talked about moments in the dialogue was your survive, revive, and thrive matrix. Can you explain that for us in a bit more detail?
I'll go into a little bit more detail, Claire. I think it does really give us some insight into a lot of the trials and tribulations of where organisations actually find themselves and don't recognise where they are, and probably starts to give them signposts to you're actually in a complicated, you're solving problems with complicated mindsets and not using the skill set you need for complex environments. So what we had on the horizontal axis is time horizon. We had from being focused on the past, using processes from the past, using business models that you've been successful with historically on one end, across to the other end on the time horizon is looking at the future. What are the business models? What are the operational models we're going to have to embrace to deal with the complexity of the future, which is unknown, and be able to deal with that? On the vertical axis, we had uncertainty, and uncertainty kind of went from at the bottom from fear. Now, what is the psychological response to uncertainty? Is it fear at one end? On the other end, at the top end, is it opportunity? So as I face the reorg structure, Christine, that you mentioned, do I see that as a great opportunity for my own advancement, or do I sit back and go, I'm not sure what's happening here? And you get a feeling of, depending on where you are in the organisation, of kind of helplessness. I'm kind of at the mercy of the gods that control all of this environment. So what that means, though, is that if we're kind of working in a business model that's using past processes that are going to be successful, and we're dealing with uncertainty and there's a feeling of helplessness about our ability to respond to that, we're kind of in this trapped zone. And that's a really bad place to be. And many organisations find themselves in there, that when disruption comes in, the call for transformation comes out, uncertainty is at its highest level. We're in this kind of, what do we do? And we've got to move through that, because you can't live there. That's the kind of death zone. The organisation, you will either, a couple of things will happen. You'll either be restructured out, you will choose to find employment elsewhere, or the organisation will actually shut down or be bought out. So you cannot move. You've got to go across what we call the line of survival into no man's land. And then you've got some options. But it's going to take courage to get across to the thrive area. So we might revive there. We might be able to focus on and deal with uncertainty and live with that productive discomfort and swim in the ambiguity that I've mentioned. And we will start on looking at what the transformation and getting people on board with that. So we're either going to have warriors who need resources and reinforcements to fight their way out of the environment they find themselves in, or they're wounded down in the other quadrant. But ultimately, you will start seeing captains who have parts of the solution, but they need organising. You move across the corridor of courage with resilience. So none of this is easy. And then you find yourself in the thrive zone, which is then the ambit of strategic leadership gets you there. So that's a little bit of an overview of the model itself, but it really, at its core, are you focused on the future and you see uncertainty through the lens of opportunity, not through fear and helplessness?
This schema, Richard, really paints a vivid picture for me. And some of the vivid elements are, and you've used this language before, this corridor of courage, that hard slog of moving through uncertainty and staying focused on the future and building the muscle to adapt. Though it seems to me that we really too often glamorize transformation, and in that glamorization, we forget about or underestimate it, it's at the least, the effort and the energy used and the exhaustion that actually results from doing this. What I see as being in no man's land is really tough. And especially when leaders are expected to be both, for instance, chief firefighter as well as the chief futurist.
Yeah, so interesting. I also really enjoyed hearing about this framework as well, and the role of captain that came in as people who keep us going, keep us following the direction, keeping it directional in terms of the problems or the change that we're looking for, the problems we're trying to solve, the change and the transformation that we're looking for. They need to keep up a culture within the organisation, but they can't do it alone. And I wondered whether or not, is there a call for more captains, or it's a collective, it's like a system of captains that can enable the transformation, that are directional and keeping that mindset of opportunity.
I think, Christine, to build on that, what you typically find is the captains are operating in isolation and they're not aligned. So the role of the strategic leader is to align the captains to get into that transformation, into that thrive zone, because you've got pockets of excellence, and we all work in organizations and can say, well, there's some pockets of excellence here and such, in my terms, the captain is leading that, but there's no orchestration around that. And that's the role of a strategic leader.
It strikes me as we talk about this, we're talking about aspects of the leadership tax, the costs of being a leader in today's organisation. And I really liked kind of the discussion that followed from this framework, where we talked about leadership being a mindset. You talk about that very eloquently, Richard, when you say leaders make a decision to move out of being trapped. They make a decision to move out of no man's land. Those leaders who can see the opportunity in the chaos or the opportunity in the complexity are the leaders who we really need to drive that through. So I love this thinking of leadership being a mindset, and an adaptive and flexible and curious mindset being the mindset that we need for strategic leadership. We need to cultivate this at every level, especially in times of complexity. So let's talk about the neuroscience. I brought up in the dialogue how under pressure our brain kicks into survival mode. Our limbic reptilian brain kicks in and stops the execution of our neocortex, or our executive functioning. And our brain concentrates just on the basic fundamentals. Do I fight? Do I flee? Or do I freeze?
And Claire, this is so important, and it strikes me, really sort of, again, vivid, perhaps I use that word too often, but in a really vivid way, that we are humans, and we're the product of deep evolution. And that's why we have these neocortex sort of elements to allow us to fight or fly or survive or freeze. And yet we're in organizations that often provide quite simplistic and mechanistic ways of motivating us. KPIs, for instance. So if you look at many of the systems in our organizations, they are about rewarding certainty, and we've explored the relevance or otherwise of certainty in complexity. And so they're looking at issues around certainty and speed, which might not make sense. Should actually some of the KPIs be related to stillness? Should they be related to sense making? Should they be related to some of those ideas of, as Richard was just giving us, the captain of the captains, orchestrating and holding the environment and shaping the environment for people to make sense of it? Nonetheless, if we have those KPIs that are focused around certainty and speed, we're going to double down on those and ultimately reward poor decisions. And for me, that's problematic. And so when we get to measuring those sorts of things, if our KPIs are rewarding only elements around speed or certainty, they're often focused on short-term outputs as well. And so we're building a system that's not really about developing capability for us and our organizations and our systems to be led in ambiguity. We're just actually building systems that barely help us survive.
And that's dangerous, Michael. It's really interesting what you're raising there, because many of the KPIs that organisations adopt are measuring the past. And to go back to the framework that I've just elucidated on, is that has them focusing the time horizon on the past. Yes, there are lead indicators, but much more weight's given to the lag indicators. We've measured those, and many organisations, and I can say this because I'm a trained accountant, are run by the spreadsheet warriors. So the columns and rows all have to add up. That's the complicated domain, and that certainty that you get by having a spreadsheet that adds up, that says we've got 1,000 people too many, we've got to get rid of those people. That's as I've said, that's really dangerous, because the environment that we're going to increasingly find ourselves in is the complex environment, and we're not building the adaptive capacity in our leaders to move through no man's land, through the corridor of courage, up there into an area where the organisation can thrive. And this, to pick up on Claire, the point that I made, that strategic leadership is a state of mind. It's not a position. It's a state of mind. And that's really important, that we're all strategic leaders in some way, shape or form. We've all got a part to play in this. And that's the role of leadership in an organisation.
Yeah, I love that. It is a state of mind. It's not a position by any means. And I really love the concept that you talked about, you introduced from Dave Snowden's the safe to fail, failing fast methodology, and the courage that it takes for leaders to be able to front that. But let's go deeper into the attributes of strategic leaders. Richard, you presented a model with some core capabilities for strategic leaders in the face of complexity. Let's break that down a little bit.
Yeah, I'd love to, Claire. So there are three enabling attributes. The first one is thinking systemically. And from that perspective, we're looking at how do you synthesize information quickly and readily, look at the big picture. It relies on Peter Senger's view of systems thinking, not systems dynamic thinking. So it's a different thing altogether. It's your ability to deal, as we've mentioned, or as I've mentioned, non-linear causality, multivariants that all overlap and cause many different things to be raised. And then we need an opportunity as a leader that I look at a lens through, when we move from our ability as strategic leaders to think systemically, through the lens of being able to focus on the second key attribute, which is how we create value, and understanding how value is created, and focusing on the things that we want to do more of, and acknowledging the things that aren't adding value that we need to be doing less of. And when we go over into that creating value attribute, it's thinking about, well, who, what, how, when, and why are we creating value? So we start at some of the core parts of looking at our employees. How do we create value for our employees? And we can go really deep on this, and you can go back to people like Richard Branson and the way he's run his organisation. It's employees first. If you do the right thing by your employees, they'll do the right thing by your customers, because that's a second attribute of the value creation segment, is how do we create value for our customers, and understanding how that links together. That's really important. Now, if we get it right for our employees, we get it right for our customers, we're going to get it right for our shareholders, which is the third part of that equation, which is how do we create value for financial value for organizations. And that still is relevant for, clearly, organizations listed on a stock exchange, but it's also useful for not-for-profits or for-purpose organizations, because they all use financial resources. So it's understanding where, for instance, you actually set the profit lever. Now, the third enabling attribute, which is one could even say is the most important, is what's the culture we're building in the organization, and what are the things we're using to build culture. And the three things that are enablers there are our ability to constructively challenge the status quo. And that is, if you did anything as a leader, creating that in your organization will probably solve most of your problems. But because what happens is that in organizations are wedded to the status quo. The vast majority of people have come up through the organization and are very happy with how things work now. And anyone who wants to challenge that constructively is seen to be perhaps putting their head above the parapet and can get it knocked off. So it pushes good ideas down in the organization, doesn't allow new leaders to come up through the organization. It causes a whole heap of problems. This is why we talk about psychological safety now, because if you're not creating a psychologically safe space to challenge the status quo, your organization's never going to be able to deal with complexity, because the people with the best view of the problem are the people that are in the problem, not the people on the 21st floor in the penthouse of the organization. It's the people out there on the battlefield, to use that warrior analogy again. Working as collaboratively across the different functions is incredibly important. So not having what one might refer to as towers of excellence within organizations, breaking down those towers of excellence and allowing collaboration. And of course, one of the key things in dealing with complex environments for a strategic leader is the use of teams and the power of teams and the power for them to bring the perspective that you need to solve the problems. And of course, we need passion and we need long-term outlooks that now allow us to have clarity, anticipation, and execute with a sense of urgency.
And I think, Richard, you talked about a fourth attribute in the dialogue around focus.
I did. So focus is incredibly important in focusing on the things that are going to create the most. If we think about some of the basics of fundamentals of systems thinking, finding the levers in the system where small changes lead to huge impacts. So Archimedes, you give me a lever long enough, I can move the earth. That's the sort of thing we're looking for with focus. Focus on the things that are going to add the most value, that have the most leverage points, that are going to give you the most value. And that's why you need that systemic thinking ability to find those points. Otherwise, you're going to be trying to boil the ocean, and you know how successful that ends up being.
So, Richard, in this, you're painting a picture that has a stark divide between leadership in a very technical and mechanistic mode, often the way in the world that we've been educated in our formative years in organizations, versus leaders or operating in complex and uncertain environments. There's a very stark difference between the two. And it seems to me, again, to draw attention back to that very personal and the individual, there's a sense of loss. And in fact, I'm going to go even further. I think it's a sense of grief that we need to be pretty honest about here. We're losing stuff. And this came up in the dialogue previously. So for me, it seems that we have to let go of technical expertise. And it's something that often we built our identity upon. And we've had many years of working with a level of increasing comfort in that domain. And now it's got to change. And there's deep loss that we have to experience. So I'm curious. I think I'm living part of that journey of this grief and loss as we transition into a world that is increasingly uncertain and increasingly complex.
I wonder if we think about that I love where you're going, right? Because if you've been an expert and you've been recognized for being an expert, then how do you suddenly let that go? But maybe we can acknowledge the strengths that come with being an expert, and instead of grieving the loss, thinking that we're adding to our toolkit. So we're generating into, we're evolving and learning new things that are making us even bigger than what we were before. I wonder if it's a reframe of loss and grief to growth
I
and
think it's,
an
oh,
addition.
sorry. I think it's probably both and, right? There
Yeah.
is a loss and there's an opportunity. And for me, that talks to the level of emotional maturity that we really need when we've got leaders who are dealing with complexity and navigating their teams and their organizations through complexity. We really underestimate the role of maturity and wisdom and confidence, I think, in our leaders and what's required from them. Let's wrap this up. I'm curious, what's one thing each of you would like leaders to do differently after listening to this podcast?
I might kick us off, Claire. So I think the biggest thing for me is recognizing when they're dealing with a problem that if there's even a sniff that it's behavioral, that they're really working in a complex environment, and to start recognizing the skills they need to start solving those problems won't be found in the traditional skills they've found that have helped them in the complicated environment. And then to parlay that into creating the environment where they can have, picking up on Snowden's terminology, those safe to fail experiments, and the ability with the organization to allow that to happen, I think is what we need from much more in our leaders today.
So you're talking there, Richard, about spending enough time in the problem space to identify what type of leadership is required.
Correct.
What about you, Christine?
I think maybe jumping off the conversation we've been having, and I think for me it relates to leaning into learning and noticing how complexity enables us to learn something new by gathering different perspectives, or by, not relying on our technical expertise, but trying out different things. So perhaps it's around, as a leader, how we create, acknowledge, and recognize people and organizations and cultures that are learning. Rewarding learning processes. When Richard talked about being safe to fail, that's a learning process. Rewarding learning processes, because sometimes we're not going to get it right. Rewarding experimentation and acknowledging that, and perhaps talking about that as the sort of the edge, the new paradigm beyond technical expertise.
Yeah, I love that too. That's learning agility in action, and it's also psych safety in action, right? And what about you, Michael?
Taking into account that which Richard and Christine spoke about, that notion of what is the most effective, impactful leadership style we hold in the environment that we need to be working in, and having that ultimate curiosity and that learning against that. We still need to measure what the effectiveness of what we're doing. So mine is KPIs. Blow the things up, or at least look at them really critically and align them to what we're talking about. So if our KPIs don't align with notions around adaptability, systems thinking, long-term impact, I think they're possibly part of the problem. So for me, it's about KPIs.
Love it, Michael. And for me, it's always pay attention to where you're spending your time and where your energy goes to. In a complex world, it's so tempting to want to go into solution mode and jump into fixing the problem. I keep coming back to this concept of spending enough time in the problem space to understand what you're dealing with, and then having the courage to pause, to reflect, to think about how do you face into this as a leader. This is one of my favourite conversations, thoughtful, messy, and deeply, deeply human. If you're facing complexity, and let's be honest, who isn't, we hope today's dialogue offered some clarity, some companionship, and a few provocations. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a colleague, subscribe to our podcast, and visit theleadershipexperiment.com for more resources from this dialogue, including the full paper and upcoming events. And remember, the real measure of strategic leadership isn't how well you predict the future, it's how well you help others to navigate it. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Michael. And thank you all for listening. Until next time, lead with curiosity, lead with courage. Bye for now.
For more information on the Leadership Experiment and to join our community, please go to www.theleadershipexperiment.com. Thank you for listening.